The barking and shouting were heard by everyone in the neighborhood. They went to see what was going on because they were concerned about the situation. Some even brought weapons, and they couldn't believe their eyes when they arrived. The final funeral procession was on its way to the cemetery. A couple of children who apparently had some family connection with the deceased were unaware of what was going on and ran happily through the cemetery. The adults were so preoccupied with their grief that they didn't notice the children had separated from them. We'll find out the entire story by the end of the video, but first, like and share it with others, and make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on. The boys were looking over the graves with curiosity when they noticed a dog on one of them. They didn't hesitate to call it, perplexed by such a scene. The dog only moved its ears and gave them a blank stare. The miners tried to approach, but the dog growled and raised his head. He didn't let them get too close. The sudden, raspy voice of a woman behind them startled the boys. His master is buried there, and he'll not leave his own accord. They turned to see who it was when they noticed a scruffy-looking stranger. She was a homeless woman who was able to collect a bag of food. She then propositioned the animal, placed something to eat in front of it, and walked away. The lady, who was about to eat a sandwich, said that they call him Sergeant. When she noticed the children's interest, she sat down on a bench and began telling them about the dog. Sergeant is a lonely dog, a perplexing creature. He doesn't allow anyone to pet him, and while he was probably once friendly, he may snap if someone tries to hunt down him away. In fact, he was a cop, and when people find out how he died, they were afraid to pursue it. However, someone dared to call the pound one day. Sergeant seemed to sense that they were going to come after him, and when they did, he wasn't to be found. Then it was discovered that the dog had hidden in a barn away from the cemetery, and when they realized that no one was looking for him, he began to return to the grave. No one bothered him until late in the afternoon, when most of the residents were leaving the cemetery, and he continued to suffer alone. The truth is no longer howling or barking. He appeared to realize that this was pointless, but the local canine could not forget his owner and stayed with him all night. And what about the officer's family? They don't need any more complications, and they didn't even try to kidnap him. And what caused the officer's death? Questioned a boy who was looking at a photo of a relatively young man on the tombstone, despite the fact that, based on the photo, he was only 40 years old. According to the beggar girl, he died in strange circumstances. The boys fell silent, ready to listen to an incredibly interesting and enigmatic story. However, the stranger's response let them down. He was discovered hanging in the woods. He had to be depressed, she reasoned calmly, before falling silent. They were startled to hear someone calling out the children. It turned out that one of their fathers had noticed their absence and was calling out for them in the cemetery. Fearful, the boys bolted. The homeless woman stood there staring at them. Winter arrived, and the dog remained in the grave during the day, no matter how cold it was. Locals who knew he was hiding in a barn brought him food, and people in the cemetery also took care of him, so he didn't go hungry. He just kept being grumpy around people. Passage of time, snow started to melt, but the cold persisted. Near the cemetery, there was also a lake, and because there was almost no ice, some fishermen went there. Sergeant was awakened one night by the sound of an engine. Something was wrong at the time, according to the dog. Then he noticed a van moving slowly, perhaps to avoid drawing attention with the noise of the engine. Neither had their headlights turned on. The moonlight illuminated the night, and the road was clearly visible. So two men got out of the car, opened the trunk, took out a large black bag, and began dragging it to the water. And even though he let out a shout, dropped the bag, and started fighting the dog, who grabbed his hand. However, the more he pushed him away, the more his jaw tensed as he growled in rage. The second man was perplexed. He thought it was a wolf that came out of the forest because he couldn't let go of a portion of the bag. He was taken aback and was unable to react promptly to what was going on. And in the meantime, the first person pulled out a knife and began stabbing the dog. As a result, the canine eventually let him go, but he jumped on top of the other man. The guy with the knife complained about his bloodied hand and was unable to help his friend, who had injured his leg, and it wasn't until the other guy started screaming that he realized what was going on. The man tried to attack the dog again with a knife, but the dog bit his arm to avoid him. Sergeant threw himself at first to one, then to the other. He was still strong despite the fact that he was bleeding. The men were attempting to be quiet, but their screams drew attention. Even though there was a forest nearby, people began to flock to the noise. Local hunters took their weapons because they were aware that wild animals occasionally attack people. People sided with the dog because Sargent was dealing with a stranger. They thought the dog became aggressive at one point, but they believed he would not have left his owner's grave if something more serious had occurred. And so it was. Sargent lay on the ground, bleeding and moaning in agony, staring out at the lake. When he was a puppy, he was placed in a suitcase and tossed overboard. Then his late owner came to his aid. The puppy was perplexed as to why he'd been placed in a bag. He was terrified until he met the warm hands of a stranger. The dog shivered from the cold, looking perplexed at the man who placed him on his chest for protection. That's how the puppy found a new home, a proper name, and a caring owner. Sargent had matured considerably, but this didn't frighten the owner. Despite the fact that his loyal companion was not a purebred dog, he was adored. Sargent resembled a German shepherd with half-floppy ears and large paws. The dog was unable to accept the death of his owner. Even in death, he remained faithful to him. Sargent remembered how he ended up in that situation when he saw two men dragging something into the water. He realized right away that the bag contained a person who was in danger. He ran away from the position to save him. People who responded to the noise discovered two badly injured men and a dog with cuts inside a large black bag that was moving. While the others rushed to open the bag, the hunter pointed his gun at the subjects. It was later revealed that the bandits attempted to drown the old man. His name was Nikolai, and he was a resident of another city. He went to the lake armed with a fishing rod. He didn't get hot enough. The sun turned out to be deceptive, and he became cold after catching a couple of fish. He did not, however, return home right away. He wanted to go deeper into the forest, where he came across two men sitting around a campfire. Nikolai was a gregarious individual. He asked their permission to sit with them and share some warmth while they exchanged a few words. They initially speak normally. Then the old man hinted about his vehicle, and the guys began to inquire about it. They wanted to know which store he had left it in. Initially, the old man didn't suspect anything was wrong with it and told them. Those guys, on the other hand, looked at him angrily. Nikolai decided it was best if he got out of there as soon as possible. Maybe he said something stupid. He began to say his goodbyes when one of the men jumped on him, started a fight, and was hit hard on the head. The old man awoke in a bag, heard a big commotion, and then was taken out. Those convicts you see were fugitives and dangerous. Nikolai had confirmed his own death sentence after meeting them. They were going to kill him and profit from whatever they discovered. And to their surprise, they discovered that the car could help them escape. They discovered where he had parked the car. They stunned him, searched his pockets, and planned to drown him. Before it got dark, one of them discovered the van and drove it to his friend and the old man. They also cooked the fish Nikolai had brought. They appeared to be rejoicing over what had occurred. Even though there was no sign of life in the old man, they considered leaving him there at first, but decided to finish him once and for all. So they wrapped his body in bags found in the car and drove him to the lake to bury him. They did not, however, expect to find a dog. Finally, Nikolai was rescued and they found Sargent. However, the man insisted on taking him to the vet. Even though the locals said it was better for him, he couldn't let him die. He's still very attached to the owner, so it'll be better for him and he'll be less of a torment for the poor dog. In any case, a neighbor predicted that he would rush to the grave and die of grief. A hunter even offered to shoot him to put an end to his agony. And even though if Sargent decided to return to the cemetery, he'd look after him. However, after his recovery, the dog no longer attempted to return to his deceased owner's grave. He apparently let him go and found a new one in return. During the investigation, it was discovered that the criminals were responsible for the death of the policeman, Sargent's owner, who happened to stumble upon the men's tracks. They needed to find shelter, so he went into the woods. But the feuds have found him first and hanged him, giving him the impression that the officer chose to end his life. The case would have been closed if no personal belongings of the police officer had been discovered with the convicts. As a result, they had no choice but to confess to everything. Sargent avenged his owner in an incident that aided in the capture of the criminals. Yes, it appears that the dog was just waiting for the day when he could be useful. Apparently, the owner from beyond the grave desired justice and finally ensured that his friend was safe. He ascended to heaven. Sargent, sensing this, finally calmed down, despite the fact that many believed he would spend the rest of his life in the grave. Without a doubt, this is a moving story. Animals will never cease to amaze us. You don't think so, do you? What are your thoughts on this story, friends? How's this even possible? Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section. This concludes today's discussion. Make sure your browser's notification bell's turned on. Hopefully you'll keep it in mind at all times. We'll talk to you soon. and we bid you a farewell.